Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Dimitris Papadimitriou. I'm the director of the Manchester Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. This is one of our last events in our seminar series this year. We are delighted that for this particular one, which is brilliant, we are joining up with the Manchester China Institute. So we are co-hosting it, and I will make some brief introductions for the people you see on your screen before I introduce our main speaker. My colleague Xiaobing Wang is the works for the Department of Economics here in Manchester, and he's a leading academic in the Manchester China Institute. To the right of my screen, at least, Dr. Catherine Simpson, who is the Vice Director of the Manchester Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. You have seen Catherine on many of our events before, but none of us are the reason why you're joining here. I think that we're all very excited to welcome to our seminar series Professor Paul Irwin Crookes, who is a leading scholar in the study of relations between the European Union and China. He is the director of graduate studies at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. He's also the director of the Oxford Contemporary China Studies. He's an old friend of our center in previous years before he chose to move to provincial universities here in the UK. He was one of our very good colleagues in Manchester, in the University of Manchester. Paul has his expertise is very well known. He has written a number of books and good articles on EU and China, but also more recently on the impact of Brexit on UK-Chinese relations. He has also written on Taiwan and so on. So a very well-placed person to tell us more about the future of relations between the European Union and China at a conjuncture, of course, that is very interesting, very turbulent. So we're all very excited to welcome him here. So Paul, thank you for coming virtually, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction, Dimitris, and I'm delighted to be back speaking to the Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence in Manchester, although shame I can't be with you in Manchester, but never mind, technology enables us to take part anyway. So thank you. Today I'd like to talk about the developing landscape of EU-China relations, and it is developing almost by the day, but I'd like also to situate the relationship and to offer some sort of structure for how we can better understand where the relationship has evolved from, the implications of the tensions that clearly exist within the relationship, but also to examine how the EU as an international actor copes with its relations with a power such as China, and how this coping takes account of the complexities of how the EU operates as an international actor. And of course, one of its key features is a normative power. But I think that one of the most interesting evolutions over recent years is how China is now arguably stepping up itself to be a normative power with its own views, values, approaches, models, and confidence to be able to put those forward into the international space. So that's something which I've captured in this idea of discourse power, which moves beyond just this idea of political and economic power that are the conventional platforms of many aspects of international relations. So I'd certainly like to be able to touch on that because I think it's a significant point for now, but also into the future as we try and evaluate potential scenarios looking forward. And I will offer at the end a very straightforward and simple structure to try and perhaps locate some of the key areas of tension, but also looking at some areas where there are still cooperation, areas of optimism, but where in fact pessimism also raises its head too. So a few things to think about as we step forward. First of all, then, let's just try and locate EU-China relations in the panoply of international relations more generally. I know that in the lexicon of the European Union, there are various words, including pillars in the past and competences and things of that kind. I prefer the idea of engagement domains as a phrase, because it almost allows there to be a merging between two or more domains, a bit like a collection of Venn diagrams. So you have the traditional trade and investment relationship, which is long-standing and is very important. You then also have domains that overlap with global governance and the institutions at the international level, and China's view of the evolution of this global governance arrangement, and of course the European Union's focus on what it sees as effective multilateralism, the way in which as a norm we should be solving our problems at the international level. But then in addition to that, there are other areas where the two powers have come together, and indeed beneath the radar of the more high visibility areas of tension, technical assistance has been quite successful over the past few years, in particular areas that I've studied, such as intellectual property legal development has been part of joint initiatives funded both by the EU and various ministries in China to empower Chinese judges to understand better the implications of decision making in intellectual property courts. And those are areas which are below the radar of some of the key areas of tension. And yet also we have to take into account the politics and society issues where there have been far less successful behind the border initiatives, and indeed where perhaps the normative collision is at its most sharp. But beyond these domains of engagement, there are also institutional engagement, and it's important to understand that the EU is an international actor, and since 2011 has had special status at the United Nations, has been an active participant in various ASEAN led institutional engagements, but also of course takes a place in various organizational structures such as the G20, a key player in the World Trade Organization, and also a key actor within the G20 summits. Now, one particular example that is absent there is the East Asia Summit, and it's often seen as being an understandable absence because the East Asia Summit is perhaps seen more as a security domain, which the EU has traditionally not had. It will, I think, be extremely interesting to see whether negotiations to join the East Asia Summit come to fruition. They've been on and off for years and years and years, and there have been various inhibitors one way or another on multiple sides as to whether the EU should join. But as security, in particular security within both Asia Pacific and interconnected through the Russia-China relationship into the European domain becomes more key, and as strategic autonomy within the EU becomes something more significant beyond traditional domains of politics and economics, we may see the EU starting to become a more active security actor, and it may well be appropriate for the EU to take a more active role in the EAS in the years to come. One thing I ask as part of my research to myself, as well as to others that I discuss my ideas with, is, well, what kind of foreign policy actor does the EU want to be? How does it want to be seen? It is a very special kind of institution. It's more than just an intergovernmental collection of contracting parties. There are treaties which encapsulate not just relationships between supranational organizations and member states, but an active pooling of sovereignty amongst those member states, hence the idea of competences at different levels. So this foreign policy actor is a very distinctive engine of action internationally. And I would say that there's been a debate within the elites of the EU and within those of us amongst the scholarly community who follow how the EU is evolving between two fundamentally different aspects of engagement in foreign policy. The normative power that was perhaps first and most clearly encapsulated by Romano Prodi's almost evangelical call in his speech to the European Parliament in 2000, where he talked about the opportunity for the new century, for the European ideals to be pushed into the international space. So perfect capturing of what a normative power is perhaps all about. But then there are also competing economic interests that the European Union has as the key negotiator for both trade and investment policy on behalf of the member states. And sometimes there are these difficult compromises that need to be made between values that you may have to project and want to internalize elsewhere, but also economic deals that need to be made. But traditionally, there have been complexities within the EU as well, within divisions across, particularly the Parliament on one side and the Commission and Council on the other, in the relationships that these issues have, in particular with countries like China, where the Parliament has taken traditionally a much more overt focus on values and positions and the importance of human rights. One of the reasons why the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement initiated in 2007 has not gone anywhere is because of these kinds of difficulties. Why we are still dealing with dozens and dozens of different separate dialogues at different levels, rather than an overarching construction of a political coordinated relationship. So these have been long-standing difficulties within the institutions of Brussels, but those divisions are also reflected within the relationships across the member states as well. And this isn't just about the division between East and West. There are differences in viewpoint between Budapest and Prague and Vilnius in the East, and some areas of difference in relationships to China between parts of Western policies too. So you have this complexity, which does inevitably inhibit the way that the EU can be seen and has acted in foreign policy terms about China. And I think unity over Ukraine, which has been remarkable and swift in its arrival, still does not necessarily mean that the underlying tensions of these divisions have gone away in their relationship with China. And I think we see the re-election of Orban and the position that he has robustly adopted in his relationship, not just with Russia, but with China in particular, and the importance of the Belt and Road Initiative to Hungary into the future as something to consider. Exploring a little bit more, this journey over the last 20 years that the EU-China relationship has had began with a great deal of optimism, not just optimism on the EU side, premised by Romano Prodi's ideas about values projection and normative outreach, but also from the China side. So for different reasons, the early part of the 21st century was really one of optimism that a comprehensive strategic partnership would be valuable to both sides. Now, these differences were that on the EU side, I think that there was a very genuine hope and almost an expectation that through engagement, through dialogue, and through trade, there would be some sort of transformation, both politically and economically, of the Chinese party-state structure. Even if it didn't become exactly like the EU, it would be on a journey, and that the reform and opening journey would evolve in some semblance that would make China a reliable and strong partner within a neoliberal economic family. On the Chinese side, they have always been looking for major global powers to share poles of power against what they see as the hegemony of the United States, and where, in positional terms, they still see a genuine strategy of containment has been the objective of the United States in the Asia Pacific. Even the phrase Indo-Pacific is seen by many Chinese elites as being a target to challenge the Chinese position within the Asia Pacific region. Now, over time, there were a number of issues and problems, which I will touch upon in a moment, that have inhibited and reduced that level of optimism on both sides. The EU has not necessarily taken on a distinctive pole of power role. Inevitably, there were a lot of concerns about the whole issue of multipolarity anyway, because the EU believes in effective multilateralism, not multipolarity. But also on the Chinese side, there were concerns about the extent to which America remains an elephant in the room. There are also concerns on the EU side about the direction of China's reform journey. And this led to the much more overtly hostile strategic outlook document published just before the pandemic in 2019, where China was talked about as a systemic rival and an economic competitor, as two of the most important phrases that spring to mind from that document. And then, of course, we have the 2021 Global Gateway Initiative, which is effectively a direct call to arms in order to challenge the Belt and Road Initiative that is seen as having a direct effect on relations between some parts of the Eastern European bloc and China. And this is interesting because it reinforces norms. If you look at the way in which it has been linked to creating links, not dependencies, and to furthering the norms and values of the EU, norms are back in the forefront of international politics. And I think those normative differences are being sharpened by the differences in the direction of the Chinese economic as well as political development. Now, speaking of economics, those ties remain very significant. 1.9 billion euros a day, nearly 700 billion euros a year of goods trade, still very significant, and yet has also significant feature has been the deficit in China's favor, which is helping to fuel ongoing reciprocity tensions in this relationship about access, about equality of access and level playing field of regulatory burdens. But equally, the European Union, like many advanced economies, is fundamentally also a services-led economy as well. And trade and services is still tumbling along at around about 10% of the trade in goods. And this is, again, one of the key areas where the European Union would like to unlock China in some ways, and that there have been difficulties and inhibitors to do that. But investment has almost, at least in the recent past, eclipsed the tensions of trade, which have been ongoing for some time, because investment has become a priority area for China as well. It is now a significant outward investor. And apart from some very welcome market-seeking investment, one of the areas where China has been active is in technology-seeking investment in advanced economies, in America, in Britain, and in the European Union. And this technology-seeking investment has led to certain concerns about how technology know-how and technology products and technology companies, especially in the vertically integrated economies such as Germany, where the Mittelstand firms were explicitly targeted by China's Made in 2025 initiative, they led to a sharp spike around about 2015, 2016 in the extent of investment from China into Europe. And that led to a number of negative responses, which have evolved into a number of monitoring and regulatory initiatives to control investment. Whilst China is not necessarily explicitly mentioned in legislation, the message underlying these concerns is that the creation of relationships and foreign direct investment targeting needs to be considered in the whole, and it needs to be considered as to where that technology is going, what use of that technology is going to be made, and how that technology could end up being used in a competitive way against the host country. So these are things now that have been wrapped up into legislative initiatives. One area where there was a lot of optimism about the opportunities to build the bedrock of more institutional relationship was with the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. And although there are lots of debates about whether that was a good deal or a bad deal, or whether it was a deal slewed in China's favor or the EU's favor. What really matters is that it's not going anywhere at the moment because of the developments that occurred last year over sanctions that were imposed by China on MEPs and other EU actors. So we have an inhibitor even in areas where there was at least some feeling that we could be rebuilding a structure and the relationship. Now, China has its own perspectives on the EU, and those are not wholly negative. There are positive perspectives about how the EU is able to integrate member states of different economic levels when they first join. And that's important for China because of its own objectives to bring greater coordination of development, and indeed the Common Prosperity Agenda is focused upon that. Equally, at least traditionally, there's never been seen as a strategic rivalry that there is with the United States. Now, whether this will actually change, given the developments into the future, that's an argument that we need to evaluate and consider, but there needs to be further evidence before we can really come to some sort of conclusion on that. But certainly that's never been seen as quite the sharp dynamic that has existed in the US-China relationship. Nevertheless, there are these negatives that are persisting, and they've been ongoing for many, many years. This idea of EU's political rights versus China's economic rights, which are now very sharpened in China's much more activist focus within the United Nations Human Rights Council, where it's much more confident about coalition building, about projecting its own position about what are legitimate human rights and the developmental elements of human rights beyond just the politics that China puts forward. That the EU is seen as putting forward. And then in the end, there is this inherent disappointment that the EU is not stepping up as a pole of power. Well, interestingly, clearly, that has potentially been reshaped by the way in which strategic autonomy is now becoming an issue of consideration across the EU. But nevertheless, the relationship across the Atlantic is still a very, very strong one and cannot be ignored in any way. So the idea that the EU would be some sort of ballast against hegemonism from the United States is perhaps one that was not well placed in the first place. Very briefly, I just want to touch on a few case studies where we can put this into some context. Trade, market economy, the direction of China's economic reforms, research and innovation, and the discourse power of China. And my overall argument here is I think that there is a growing trust deficit, which is now a singular part of the relationship, and that to some extent that has replaced the values gap that was often seen as being the biggest inhibitor to a close relationship. But the thing is, you can bridge a gap and you can make inroads to make sure that you build ways of talking to each other. Has the trust deficit actually meant that it's now much harder to make a positive and optimistic relationship for the future? Well, trade is an example where things, despite the incredible numbers, have not been well and are not going well and continue not to be going well. Unfairnesses persist across China's engagement in the international trade sphere, according to the EU's viewpoint on this, that there is bad faith even now against commitments made 20 years ago, that technical barriers to trade remain, and that subsidies are a major problem, and that China is inhibiting the inclusion of proper subsidies at the full level that is necessary within WTO trade reform negotiations. So that is not going well. China's view, however, is completely upended on the basis that they see that the ongoing refusal to recognize China as a market economy after 40 years of reform and opening is simply a deep lack of respect. It is pushing against the strategic partnership. And it was captured perfectly in one interview I had with a senior Chinese diplomat who said, it's like slapping your face and then saying, let's be partners. So that their view is that this is a rule-setting excuse for protectionism across the EU against China's legitimate competition. So it's very hard to bridge these gaps, despite the fact that trade continues. There are clearly major initiative problems to move towards a free trade agreement. But part of the underlying problem, and an incredibly important element, I think, of this movement towards this systemic rivalry idea, is this idea of China's reform journey having taken a different turn. Despite the decision and the rhetoric that was announced in 2013 and afterwards by the Chinese party state, the viewpoint is now increasingly that reform towards a neoliberal framework with a light touch party state system, a market-driven collective, is not something that is the direction that the Chinese leadership wish to take the country's economy, that the party state's role has grown, the role of state-owned and state-preferred enterprises has become more, not less significant, and that this poses real, genuine challenges because no longer is there a level of confidence within the Brussels elite that all of the work to build links and to help the journey towards economic reform and opening is actually shifting. And that we can see in Xi Jinping's rhetoric about how there is now this new contradiction, that we are moving beyond Deng's focus on just getting rich and being economically successful towards some different kind of framework, a different kind of structure, a different set of economic relations where the party state is still a major player in decision making and economic acting. And that this is captioned most by phrases I've heard, which is this idea of promise fatigue that has been heard in and around the corridors of Brussels. Research and innovation continues to be an area of potential gain for both sides because they share interest in a number of aspects of those areas where both sides have skills. Smart cities, sustainable urbanization, they're both faced with these problems. And also, of course, the injection of the climate crisis and the way in which it is in both economies' interests to try and arrange things such that the climate system is resolved. Well, these are areas of gain and areas of collaboration and cooperation. There are inhibitors. Intellectual property is not where the Europeans might want it to be, but nevertheless, is it a lot better than it was a few years ago. However, I would say that one of the biggest problems here is that when we had a debate at the EU-China summit a few years ago on economics and market recognition, the very genuine unity over research, innovation, climate was not sufficient to bridge the other gaps. And that particular summit did not issue a joint communique because of the differences of view. So we shouldn't think that just having shared interest is going to be enough to overcome the differences. And finally, this idea of discourse power, which I think is it's a relatively new area to view within China's international relations, but I think it's a growing area of significance because within trade terms, there are clearly preferences China has about at the border tariff agreements such as RCEP versus deep behind the border harmonization and transformations that I don't think are in accordance with China's interests or wishes. As we've already touched on in human rights, we have this idea of a counter narrative, a counter discourse, not just simply defending China's position on various things, but pushing forward a different kind of narrative that argues that, well, frankly, without development, without society stability and structure, there can't be any long-term political rights because they don't have any meaning. And that equally, that there are inherent problems in the way in which Western democracies handle their own minorities, handle their own political differences that are less effective at dealing with certain kinds of problems that face the people than the way in which China deals with them. And this is most apparent in the much more proactive assertiveness that we see in the Human Rights Council, but clearly are reflected also in the bilateral EU-China human rights dialogues, which are ongoing, but which really haven't produced very much of interest to Europeans. And then the economic model. And we've often said in the past that there was no real definition of what was the China model, and that there wasn't this idea of exporting a model as a structural framework like a Washington consensus. And that whilst that may still be true, I think that if you look at Xi Jinping's Jinping's speeches, and you look at the way in which China is clearly developing in a framework which would not have been perhaps where we would see that direction if we were looking 10 years ago under Wen Jiabao, then I think we are seeing a different kind of economic actor with a different kind of structural model for a different role of the party-state apparatus. And this is where I believe we also have a challenge that the European elites are coming to grips with. So finally, I offer this structural framework. It's a very simple, it's simply a spectrum upon which you can then map and model any number of policy overlaps. And what I think is useful and helpful is over time, I've been looking at how, in my view, these things have shifted. And whilst there are elements of stability, the EU's incoherence and inability to speak with one voice to China has largely not made a great deal of progress. But there have been other differences. The reform journey has now much more moved towards the side of the tension, and the pessimists about that reform journey are much sharper and much more widely spoken than the optimists were a few years ago. Research and innovation, which was often seen as an area of significant progress and great optimism, it's still an area of potential, but it's starting to shift. And I think that that is an interesting area. Foreign direct investment, again, when it was first initiated from China into the EU, was largely market seeking, was seen as something of great progress and was viewed with great optimism and opportunity. That is now moving inexorably towards an area of both limited progress and more overt pessimism. And then trade, which has been this ongoing dichotomy between the great success of the numbers, but also the ongoing tensions of the issues. That remains. But capturing them all is this issue of discourse, this issue of the emergence of potentially normative power that is China, challenging directly the norms of the European Union in the world and arguably even in its own backyard of candidate countries. So in conclusion, the EU-China relations are very important to both parties. They're not the most important relationship for either party, which means they're always going to be managed within a spectrum of other issues that take priority. But that it is an ongoing journey. And my argument is that perhaps we are now faced with the reality that a values gap has morphed into a trust deficit, which is much harder to resolve going forward. But the destination of the relationship is still unclear. And as I said right at the beginning, changes almost by the week. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. That was excellent, a fantastic tour de table here. Many different issues and very expert analysis. I invite the audience to submit questions on our using your Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I know that a number of you have already done, though. Probably better you do it there than in the chat, but my colleague Xiaoping and Catherine will be collating these questions in a minute. But let me perhaps kickstart the debate, Paul, and perhaps asking a relatively obvious question with a not so obvious answer. Is the war in Ukraine and what that war brings for the EU and its strategic autonomy priorities that you've already mentioned, but also what it brings for Russia, which is greater isolation, need to diversify its energy supplies and so on, deliveries rather, and so on. Would a policymaker sitting in Beijing be happy or concerned about what's going on in Ukraine?
The Party Congress later on this year is expected to confirm a third term for Xi Jinping. That is the #1 priority politically that he and his immediate cohort of elites have. In order to do that, and traditionally in order to tackle some of the economic challenges China has always looked for a stable and ideally benign, welcoming international environment. Well, the international environment at the moment is not stable, and it is increasingly not benign either. The decision rests with China. How does China wish to engage with its new partner, Russia, in such a way that it does not alienate its old partner, the EU, and also reconfirm all of the concerns that its traditional rival, the United States, has about its behavior as an international actor? So that these are differential issues that overlap. So yes, there will of course be concern. We see the concern on the European side as to what is China's strategy in its relationship with Russia, and how will that actually impact both the war in Ukraine as a conflict, but also the triangular relations between Russia, Europe, and China. And I don't think there's sufficient evidence yet to come to a conclusion. But equally, that could be because the Chinese elite may still have to be weighing up what are the implications of making one decision versus another. If I was pushed, I'd say they'd much rather not have to make any decision at all, because they would prefer that stability and peace is reestablished. I don't think any Chinese leadership elite wants a war, but at the same time, they do value an alliance with Russia, and they are having to carefully manage how that relationship is evolving in the middle of huge instability. So it's a bit of a perfect storm for those in Beijing, I would suggest.
That's great. Thanks very much, Paul. Jiabing, you want to bring in some of the questions?
All right. Thank you very much, Paul, for an interesting talk. And we have a couple of questions in the chat, and I will collect some of them, and hopefully you'll be able to answer as many as you can. So the first question is, considering the PRC sanction conducted against Lithuania, etc., during a recent row that everybody knows, and what, for example, should the EU do in terms of supporting Lithuania? That's one question. And also in terms of other similar incidents, what should you do? And the second question follow that is, what's behind China's move in terms of the sanctions, etc.?
Yes, right. Well, both very good questions, and thank you for them. I think they're actually usefully related, because the answer is broadly the same thing. It comes back to this sensitivity of Taiwan in China's overall political positioning. If we step back a little and go back to quite a few years, what you will remember is a discussion about what is China's grand strategy. Does China even have a grand strategy? And if we remember Dai Bingguo, who was the foreign policy party lead on these initiatives back in 2010, he first really publicly put forward the view that there were three clear priorities in China's political decision-making. The first was regime stability, the future of the socialist system and the party's leadership of that socialist system. Second, there was borders and sovereignty. And third, there was sustainable economic development. So regime, borders, and the economy. So if you focus on number two, that's the number two key thing that China sees as its core interests that infuse its grand strategic engagement priorities. And borders and sovereignty include Taiwan from a Beijing perspective, because Taiwan is seen from Beijing's perspective as a renegade province that should ultimately be brought back into the motherland as a whole through reunification. So this is an incredibly sensitive issue. Now, that doesn't mean to say that Beijing's view is necessarily universally agreed, but the Taiwan position is highly complex. The European Union has, by and large, and its member states, by and large, signed up to the One China principle, which recognizes that there is one China, that One China is represented in Beijing by the People's Republic, but Taiwan is part of One China. Now, beyond that, however, there are economic relationships that many member states have with Taiwan, but the naming conventions really matter. And the naming conventions that is traditionally used is the Taipei Representative Office. And what China objects to is this idea of one China, one Taiwan, or potentially even two Chinas, or even at times two areas, which may call themselves different parts of China of a bigger entity. So this is a key part of China's ongoing strategic engagement with all parties that trumps pretty much everything else. And it began back in 2010 as a first real public clarity of what this position was, but it's been oft repeated. And indeed, Xi Jinping himself knows a great deal about Taiwan, having held senior party roles in Fujian province. So what we have here, I think, is a very, very sensitive issue where Lithuania's decision, either deliberately or otherwise, from the Chinese side, is a deliberate provocation from their perspective. So that, I think, helps to explain why China is so irate about it. But what are they deciding then to do? What they're deciding to do is to seek to punish Lithuania economically, which is their standard approach. One way or another, that's what they do if you upset them in one way. I mean, Australia's found that. But they will punish based on their interests as well. Again, you know, the Australian model, coal and wine are blocked, but iron ore is not, because China needs it and Australia produces good quality iron ore. So they have focused on what they see as being ways of punishing Lithuania to correct Lithuania's mistakes. That's how the Chinese have framed it, because that's how they see it, as a fundamental provocation. But what does this do? And this helps to understand the EU's reaction. This challenges the very edifice of the single market, because there is no distinction between where something is made within and across member states within the single market. So what you have is the fundamental grand strategy to maintain territorial integrity on China being challenged, and one of the fundamental framings of the entire European project, the single market, being challenged. This has collided and happens to be visible in Lithuania. So I think that the EU has absolutely no choice but to look to reinforce the single market and to make sure that positioning is corrected. And at the same time, perhaps try and at least explain why there's the level of concern and provocation they have generated from China, but equally at the same time explain to China that individual member states are still sovereign. They have pooled sovereignty, but they still have sovereignty, and that they can make this decision if they wish to make it. It's a legitimate decision from a Lithuanian standpoint, because it's their decision to make, no one else's. So these are characteristics of a more fraught relationship, because neither side really trusts the objectives of the other. And I think this helps to show why, A, it's a very difficult decision and a very difficult issue to easily resolve, but B, why it is so fundamentally important to both sides.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to kind of group three questions together. The first question is, what or who is responsible for the fraught ties between China and France since Chirac? The second one is, how does China perceive Brexit, and what is its impact on EU-China relations as a consequence? And the third one is, do you feel that the United States needs to be more bullish in its approach by being more concerned with the kind of trade expansion of China than the ever-expanding Belt and Road that can cause those trade rifts between partner economies?
Great. Very wide-ranging. So the first one then, France relations. Well, in fact, if you look at the numbers, France, Germany, Italy, and when as a member state, the UK, were major trading partners between the EU and China. And also the top three recipients of inward investment from China into the EU were Germany, France, and the United Kingdom when the UK was a member. So it depends on how you characterize fraught. There is the relationship, which has been economically a positive one in numbers terms for both sides, and there are successful French companies in China, and there are successful initiatives and collaborations between French elements and Chinese elements, and there are very strong French located area studies, academic departments and communities and cultural offices that focus on China and take a great interest in China. So in that sense, I think there are elements where France and China have been in a positive relationship. But in the same way as the EU has great success in one sense, there are equally areas of difficulty in other senses. France is a liberal democracy. France is a key member of international communities as a major security actor, and of course has a role to play as an aircraft carrier country and a nuclear power on the world stage, and in particular potentially prospectively in the Asia Pacific as well. So we have this area of potential tension, but we also have opportunities to collaborate. And it's a question really of whether or not this area of tension can be overcome. And this comes back to this whole issue of trust. Does the French leadership, just like the EU leadership, trust where China's going, trust China as a reliable partner? And I think that is now open to question, and has been open to question for a good few years. But economically, both sides want to be able to, in a nicest possible way, exploit each other. Economic relationships have been ongoing, but there are these underlying political and potential security collisions, which are more problematic. So that's how I would address that. I'd address it by saying that it isn't all bad, but that where there are problems, these problems are actually reflective of wider problems within the EU and China as a whole, not just related to France. And in fact, I would point to the fact, there are challenges between Germany and France as well, and China as well. So Britain and Brexit, interesting, the whole issue there. Well, what does China think? Well, I mean, China, what does China think? What do some of the Chinese elites think that I've had the opportunity to talk to is probably about the only thing I can say. I don't know whether there's been a straw poll done of the Chinese population, but certainly the elites that I've spoken to and academics that I've communicated with are broadly of the view that it was a remarkable decision which was not seen as being particularly logical, because it generated a great amount of instability for Britain in particular, but also for Europe. And it's not clear where the economic upsides are necessarily going to be. And it was not clear to those Chinese to whom I spoke where the so-called freedom to act was not actually there already, given the fact that Britain was a major economic and political actor in the same way that France is, and that had aircraft carrier capability and is growing that aircraft carrier capability. But it's been done. So where is it going to go? Well, that's a really interesting one. There are avenues of opportunity for the UK to offer, I think, something very distinctive to China. For example, China is very keen to internationalize the renminbi, the Chinese currency, and the London Exchange is one of the best places for foreign currency management in the world, and is currently the leading non-East Asian based, not Hong Kong, not mainland China based center for RMB transactions by some considerable margin, so that there is opportunity to lend London's capabilities to help manage the internationalization of the RMB. That's something. There are then areas of technology overlap which are interesting. Britain has an excellent sector of technology and software development, inference engines, artificial intelligence capabilities, and the development of specialist products along those lines. They are areas of potentially problematic overlap because there are regulations about data protection in cooperating with Chinese initiatives, but there are also issues of concern about, well, what's going to happen to this joint technology? If we do develop a project together, what's going to happen? How can we control how it's used? Well, realistically, once it's back into China's mainland territory, you can't. So should certain projects go ahead? Should certain collaborations go ahead? These are questions that have been asked. I think it's quite interesting that over the last 6 months, I've heard 3 British security officials, Secret Intelligence Service people, people from communication centers, talk about the concerns they have about developments in issues like artificial intelligence and about the sharing of knowledge in artificial intelligence in project teams that include Chinese people. But at the same time, there are also great avenues of potential overlap and research collaboration. And indeed, in education settings and universities like ours, all of ours, have great opportunities to share knowledge and understanding and cultural affinity with people from all parts of the world, including China. So the strength of the education sector in the UK is, I think, something that is, again, important. And whether or not Britain will move into negotiations with a free trade agreement, that is down, I think, very much to what are both sides going to want to get out of it, because there is a very tough series of commitments that China would expect, I think, to have, most obvious of which would be recognition of China as a market economy, because every other Western economy that has a free trade agreement with China has recognized it in this way. I think that would be an inevitable precursor. But at the same time, there are also negotiations that Britain wants to build on with the European Union, which might be problematic if you start to compromise on certain things with a trade partner like China, and also the elephant in the room, the United States, where Britain has long wanted to have a free trade agreement. Well, the United States has even more deeply seated concerns about growing relationships in economic and investment terms with a country like China, and is more overt about naming China as being the country of concern than perhaps traditionally the Europeans have been. So if Britain is to make these initiatives and to make some of these compromises, even though they may be in the sides of interest on both sides in a free trade agreement with China, what are the ramifications for that free trade agreement? And I think those are things that need to be thought through, and I'm sure are being ruminated amongst the policy elite in the UK. And then the final element to this in Brexit terms was, well, what does that mean for the EU? And this is interesting because Britain was ultimately a free trader. It was one of those Northern European member states who wanted reform of some aspects of the European Union, which was seen as inhibiting free trade. I think that actually, ironically enough, Britain was an anchor point inside the qualified majority voting system, trying to push for a more relaxed approach to anti-dumping initiatives across engagement paradigms, particularly with China. And so I think China has ultimately lost, if not an ally, then somebody who was sympathetic to some of China's concerns within the EU, and that the balance of power within the EU has perhaps now shifted more overtly, because there is effectively Germany there as the key economic player who has links to China. But then there are an awful lot of others who have grave concerns, both China as an economic competitor and as a systemic rival. And these were areas where I think there was probably a little bit more relaxed approach that Britain had. And when it wielded its qualified majority voting, it often wielded in favor of being more open and being a bit more relaxed. So that has shifted the power dynamics. And finally, the American issue on the Belt and Road, I think it's the big question I ask back to people to think about in respect to the Belt and Road is it an economic venture, or is it a political initiative, or is it maybe a mixture of both? If it's particularly and overtly just an economic venture, well, Clearly, it should, if it is an international economic venture, be built on sustainable terms. It should be built on repayable capabilities to target markets. But equally, those markets, it's not unreasonable, they do need infrastructure. There is a universal understanding that the world needs more infrastructure, particularly the developing world. So as an economic entity, there are certain rules and opportunities for China to perhaps more coalesce with its own institution in the AIIB, to have more of the investments accommodate AIIB norms, which are effectively World Bank norms, rather than China Development Bank norms, which are slightly more fluid and more flexible. And that would perhaps be in China's benefit as well as in the benefit of the recipient states, and would ultimately pull the sails from America being concerned about some of these initiatives. But at the end of the day, you can't help but think, well, this is also a political initiative. There are elements of building political space here. And of course, China wants to do that. If it is to reclaim its position as a major global power of global significance and return the rejuvenation of the Chinese people to the position that they had before the difficulties of what they term the 100 years of humiliation, then that requires global roles and global alliances. And what better way of doing that is through using economic heft. So if it is a political initiative, then America sees that it has to respond politically, because this, under the concept of the collision of re-emerging powers against an existing hegemon under a realist worldview, is exactly what America needs to do to retain its position. And so therefore that makes it more logical for America to push back initiative by initiative, but also with a broader political play, because in the end, it's politics and international relations that America would be more concerned about, rather than necessarily the economic niceties of which country does or does not need infrastructure spending.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Paul.
That's great. We are running out of time. We could have stayed here for another hour easily. I think there is a lot of interest, but let me say to everybody that we'll have a chance to come back to this topic in one of our future events. Let me just firstly say many thanks to our colleagues at the Manchester China Institute for helping us to put this event together. And their support with disseminating the publicity for it. Let me also remind the audience that the Centre's annual lecture will take place in the first week of May, and we will be hosting Natalie Tocci from Harvard, who is also a senior advisor to the High Representative of the European Union right now, to talk to us about the changing security architecture in Europe. So interesting and topical with a high profile speaker. So we hope to see many of you to this too. It will be online. So make sure that you follow us on our social media channels to get the latest information. But also last but not least, let me thank again Paul for what I thought was a brilliant talk. I feel I've learned an awful lot in an hour. I knew I would, so I'm not surprised, but I'm very happy that he found the time to join us. And we do, as I said earlier on, hope that we can host him in person before too long. So thank you very much for coming, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed, Dimitris. Thank you also to everyone who helped organize this. It's been a great pleasure, and I really enjoyed meeting you all virtually, and look forward to the opportunity to see you all again in person very soon. Take care.
Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.